So, welcome to the second day of the Conference on Populism and Religion, the American Case. My name is Jean Cohen, and I'm from the Department of Political Science and co-organizer of this event. And so today, the first panel is Populism, Social Movements, Parties, and Leaders. And I'll introduce all the speakers, and then, or should I do, no, I'll introduce all of the speakers now, and then we'll hear the papers. So, Anthea Butler is a graduate chair and associate professor of religious studies, and African American studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Her forthcoming book, From Palin to Trump, Evangelicals, Race and Nationalism, will be published in fall 2008. I'm doing very short bios. Everybody has a million books and a million honors.
I would love to go back in time, but...
Yeah, I know. Vanessa Williams is a fellow at in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, and she's the author of a new book, Read My Lips, Why Americans Are Proud to Pay Taxes. Okay.
Read that book.
And Todd Gitlin is a professor of journalism and sociology and chair of the PhD program in communications at Columbia University, and his next book is a novel called The Opposition. That is a novel. All right, so we start with Vanessa. No, sorry.
We can start with Vanessa, we can start with me.
I meant Anthea.
Go?
No, Anthea. Anthea.
Okay. I'm happy to
I have the
do whatever you want to
decision.
do.
I'm the decider.
That's fine by me. Good morning, everybody. I know I got to do one big thing, which is to keep you awake on a day like this. So let me try to do that. I don't have a black preacher voice, but I'll try to project and make you feel like you need to say amen at some certain points. I came to this kind of curiously when Waleed asked me. I was trying to figure out what do I want to talk about, and I actually want to talk about something that's been a very big question for me, and that question is: do you need religion to be part of African American populist movement? And the reason why I say that is because there's been a battle that has been brewing probably for the last 4 or 5 years now on social media. I'm a big Twitter person, and maybe I should be on the media panel because I'm starting off like this. But the question has been, for a lot of people who have been involved in Black Lives Matter, is that does religion matter? Do we care? Do we care about some kind of claims to religiosity and morality in the midst of this movement because of what's been happening? And I wanted to juxtapose that today with the leader of Moral Mondays, Reverend Dr. William Barber, and the movement that they've now started, Repairers of the Breach, which is explicitly religious and very much in the sense of following after the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As you know, for African Americans in this country, the idea about populism has a lot to do with religion, whether that's religious nationalism, if you think about movements like the Nation of Islam and others, or if we think about movements that are steeped in Christianity and civil rights. And so the frame and the lens for everybody to look at African American engagement and whether we're doing marches or something like that is it explicitly religious? And so I want to start off with a story about what happened in Ferguson in August of 2014. I need to say up front that I was not in Ferguson. I don't know why people keep thinking I was there. I was actually in London at the time, so I watched a lot of it, but I tweeted as though I knew stuff was going on because I had people telling me things. So one of the things that happened was the Reverend Jesse Jackson came to town. There were a series of African American leaders who came. Jesse Jackson was there, a host of leaders. And then there were clergy that were there on the ground. He was in a car at a McDonald's. He rolled up and they said, "Hey, Reverend Jackson," and somebody's filming, "how you doing? Have you been out there marching? Have you been doing everything?" And he couldn't answer the question. And he actually got heckled at a subsequent speaking engagement that he had later on that day. Now, this is kind of interesting because if you know anything about history, you know that Jesse Jackson was seriously involved in the civil rights movement. But the young people of Black Lives Matter, which was, really nascent at the time, did not want to hear anything that he had to say. And that was because they felt as though he was an interloper coming into town to get something from them. He wanted to have press. He wanted to have money. He wanted to have something else. And so to me, this was a populist moment in the sense that the regular kinds of figures that we associate with black movements who had been in the forefront for years and years and years were suddenly being repudiated. They were being pushed back for a different kind of leadership. And I want to talk a little bit this morning about that leadership and Black Lives Matter first, and then go over to Moral Mondays, and then to close by putting out some, maybe I hope, provocative questions and thoughts about this. Black Lives Matter, for many people, is a ubiquitous symbol, and it's a ubiquitous kind of phrase that you're used to hearing all the time. It's very interesting to me that lately the Justice Department has decided that black identity movements are to be followed, but I think this stems out of the work that Black Lives Matter has been doing. Black Lives Matter came about in July 13th of 2013, right after Zimmerman was acquitted of murdering Trayvon Martin. This was a very deep time of pain for the African American community. And three women, Opal Tometi, Elisa Garza, and Patrisse Cullors, decided that they wanted to form a movement that would be put forth black lives. And one of the things that they said about this movement at the beginning was that black liberation movements created spaces for heterosexual cisgendered men, leaving women, queer, and transgenders out of this in the background. And I would say in the back of this also, if I had to sort of read into what they were saying, in other words, what they were saying is the black patriarchal church actually is a problem with how these movements are led, because everything comes out of a church movement. And so when they started this, it was populist in the sense that they were pushing against what was the norm, the general type of thing that we see in black populist movements. And they wanted to use it as an organizing tool. And so when they started, this was a kind of a movement where they thought, we're going to have this. We want to think about how we start things in terms of organizing and all that. But this really didn't come together very tight until Ferguson. And Ferguson was a moment for Black Lives Matter, because it was a moment that was a crisis moment, but it afforded the opportunity for them to come together and start to organize. This is not to say that there weren't other movements during this time period. We also have Black Youth Project, which is a very big movement at this time, and the Dream Defenders, which had actually been sitting in places in Florida and others alongside of Trayvon Martin. So people tend to think about Black Lives Matter as the big thing, but there were also these other movements where African American millennials were involved in. Now, within the movement, religion doesn't exist in this totally traditional kind of frame. You can see moral things that they talk about on their website, but they don't make explicit claims about religion. One of the things that they say is that basically religion for them, you can be religious and join the movement, but religion is not a part of what they are doing, because religion actually has been part of the issue with the kinds of people who have been closed out of other movements. So Ferguson provided this kind of event for them. But something interesting happened in Ferguson. You had people who came alongside the movement who were basically not just sort of a religious kind of figures, and they weren't religious in the sense, but they became charismatic figures. Everybody knows DeRay with the blue vest, and he has become a symbol of the movement. Well, DeRay wasn't even there the first day. He didn't get there till a week after, okay? And so the way in which people sort of think about this lore is that he must have been there from the very beginning. But there were local clergy who were there at the very beginning, and some white clergy, and those clergy members stood in between protesters and the police and tried to broker peace. Churches were open during that time period to be sort of staging areas. The police at one time actually went into one of the churches and tried to pull people out of it. And so this became kind of a way in which the church was ancillary to the Black Lives Matter movement. It was not the center of it. And so this was sort of their first phase. The second phase is sort of the rise of this charismatic leadership and what I call the marketing of Black Lives Matter as a populist movement. What happened was you began to have a lot of hashtags that showed up on social media. People could claim Black Lives Matter. There were T-shirts that were done every time there was a death, whether there was Eric Gardner, the incident that happened in Baton Rouge, other kinds of incidents around the country. Black Lives Matter would become out. You would have certain of the leaders who would mobilize very quickly, like Brittany Packnett, who is actually a person of faith, but also involved in the movement. And they would show up literally within 24 hours of a police killing or event and they would come and they would be there. But again, this was something that clergy had to get on board to, but they were not a core part of. And part of what has happened with this is that part of the issue about how they mobilize is really interesting. They don't use the traditional kind of mobilization networks. They got a lot of TV press, but they use social media. Facebook and Twitter are the ways in which they bring things together. And so one of the things I've said about this movement is that if there's a church that's associated with Black Lives Matter, it's actually Twitter. Because Twitter is the church of Black Lives Matter. This is where people meet. This is where they exchange information. It's also a space in which, the FBI and other people were monitored, and so that was a very interesting thing, especially at the beginning of the movement. But it made a coalition of people to come together. And so out of that, different things would start to happen. One of the things that happened right after Ferguson was a day of silence for Mike Brown that was started by a woman that I know on Twitter, Feminista Jones, and that was a sort of a side movement to say, we're going to come and gather, and if you want to belong to Black Lives Matter, you can belong. And so this populism of Black Lives Matter didn't really revolve around religion, but it revolved around how can we feel together in the midst of all of these hard spaces. The second thing I think is really interesting to think about in terms of populism in African Americans, especially with Black Lives Matter, is that this is surrounding a grievance, but it is a specific kind of grievance. It is a grievance about stop killing us. It is a grievance that is not just an economic grievance, but it's like a grievance about life. How do we continue to live? How are we going to do what we do without all of this? And so it's a different way, a humanistic way of looking at life. It wasn't an appeal to you should stop doing this in the name of God, because religion, in a sense, was looked at as a tool of the masses to continue to kill Black lives. And so in that sense, this was a very tough thing for Black Lives Matter. So as time has gone on, what's been interesting about the Black Lives Matter movement is that it started to coalesce. And if we think about this in sort of sociological terms, it has become more organized. People think of this in the beginning as amorphous. In a sense, Black Lives Matter kind of started off a little bit like Occupy. There were 3 leaders, but then again, they didn't have organization. But they used some of the tactics of Occupy. So if you remember how people would amplify things in Occupy when you raised your hand and somebody would speak and they would repeat things back. At the beginning of Black Lives Matter, that happened. They moved to more sophisticated methods of bringing people together in populism. But in 2016, something very interesting happened. And I think I'm not going to talk about the internal politics, because there's a lot of internal politics that happened between the 3 women and some other pieces of Black Lives Matter that have broken it up. But I want to talk about this moment at the Democratic National Convention. In 2016, people were really surprised that this sort of populist movement decided to get even better organized. And they released a vision for Black Lives Matter as part of the platform of the DNC. And they took 6 things as their platform. 1 was criminal justice, 2nd, reparations, 3rd, investment and divestment, economic justice, community control, and political power. And they put in special provisions about trans, queer, and gender nonconforming people to be protected under these things. And so this was a moment in which Black Lives Matter, in one sense, came together, but you didn't have everybody who was part of Black Lives Matter in the beginning a part of this. There's another kind of movement that's been off to the side that got funded through DeRay and some other people who are doing this, but this has been basically just kind of a standalone thing, and it's not even very much active anymore, except for one member, Sam Singaway, who basically tweets out every day lots of different kinds of statistics about racism in America and police killings. They have funding to do a lot of statistical work, but they're not doing actually what I would call populist kind of movements or out there in the street. So in this sense, here's the problem with Black Lives Matter. Not a problem necessarily, but something that poses a different kind of question. And the different kind of question is how do you keep a movement together for African Americans that does not have this sort of regular moral core? And I'm asking this as a religious studies professor because I'm interested in what pushes people to come into a movement, any kind of populist movement, and how does it keep them there? So this diffuse kind of leadership and this lack of core has been somewhat somewhat of a problem for at least older people in the community to get together with Black Lives Matter. There are lots of places like in Detroit and Chicago and others where you've actually had African-American preachers who have said they are staunchly against Black Lives Matter and that they don't want to be involved with the movement. And so this has created some issues because there's not the same kind of networks that you have normally to deal with people within the community, to have places when you have a march or something where you go to meet. If the church says you can't meet, you can't do anything. One of the big issues that has been interesting in St. Louis in the last few years is that the National Church of God in Christ has had their annual meeting there every year, and every year it is a fight between them and the Ferguson people because they're upset that they bring millions of dollars into St. Louis and they don't really do anything but one day of service. And they have eschewed being involved with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that's created some tension. So I think part of the issue is going to be for Black Lives Matter is that how do they continue and how do they put their populism forth? But let me juxtapose that with the Moral Mondays, which started with Reverend William Barber, the NAACP president in North Carolina. Barber is a very interesting and charismatic figure. You may have seen him a lot on MSNBC. This movement started in April of 2013 as a protest movement against legislation from the Republican legislatures who were really pushing back on things. Basically, they were doing four things, and this falls into, to me, in a sense, more of the kind of populism that was talked about yesterday. They were slashing unemployment benefits, they were raising taxes on the poor and working families, they were rejecting educational funds and did not want the Medicaid expansion to happen, and they were also limiting voting rights in the state. And so this was a sense in which Reverend Barber, when they started this movement and marched on the Capitol building, they only had 100 people at the time. What is interesting about this populist movement, however, is that it was already organized, and that's a kind of interesting way to think about this. You think when you see Moral Mondays, at least when it first came out on television, was that this was just spontaneous. It was not spontaneous. There were already 16 organizations in North Carolina who were working together with Barber and had been working with him for 3 years. And this was a historic St. James coalition that came together. So this was a populist movement that already had a base. It had a base of clergy and others who were involved. One of the things that's important to know about Barber is that he's not a normal kind of Black Protestant clergy out of the National Baptist tradition. He's out of the United Churches of Christ, which makes him very different in the sense that they are open and affirming. He wanted gays and lesbians to be involved, and that also actually put another wall against him and conservative Black churches who did not believe in all of this. So this populist movement has grown. They had some good success with Moral Mondays. These Mondays started to fill out across the South, where people would meet up in places like Arkansas and others to contest things that were happening in the state. And they went on an explicitly moral agenda. Reverend Barber uses scripture all of the time, and somebody yesterday talked about the kind of justice scriptures that are used in terms of this. He always talks about the same kinds of things, justice rolling down like waters. John chapter 4, where Jesus says, I've come to heal the brokenhearted and to bind up wounds. These are the kinds of things you will hear him say all the time, and others who have been involved in the Moral Monday movement. He uses the Bible for social justice and has been very explicit about it. So one of the things that he says is this is a moral challenge. It's a moral challenge because we can come together on issues of morality, and these moral issues don't mean that you necessarily have to be religious, but you need a moral core. Morality is the only way that we can organize against the kinds of injustices that are happening in the world. And so in that sense, Moral Mondays was like a real populist movement. But he's taken this movement now one step further to do what is called now Repairers of the Breach. And Repairers of the Breach is now a new organization that started in the last few months that is basically a moral agenda that's rooted in dissent against what is happening in the nation. And it is explicitly, as he says, prophetic. When you look at it online, and I probably should have pulled it up, is one of the things that they say is that we are prophets. We are going out into the community. He is explicitly looking at this. The other thing that I find very interesting about Barber is that he's doing it in the way that I would say old school. He's actually using a model from Martin Luther King because they have started a Poor People's Campaign. And if you know anything about Martin Luther King, the Poor People's Campaign started in December of 1967. It was the last big campaign of his before he was assassinated. And now Barber has revitalized that movement in a sense because he believes that with the poverty in this country, that there needs to be something different that happens for people who are poor and disenfranchised. Let me say two things about both of these movements very quickly. One of the things that's interesting to me about both of these movements is that they're both interracial. They are both interracially mixed. In Black Lives Matter, what ends up happening is that you usually have black leaders in the front in a march, but there are whites and other people who have been arrested and have been greatly involved in Black Lives Matter. In Moral Mondays and in Repairs of the Breach, this is an interfaith, interreligious coalition of people who have come together who are also interracial. And so I think particularly for these kinds of issues of civil rights, interracialism is another sort of subset. And what people think about that religiously is very important. I have not teased that out yet, but I think that's an important question. And maybe we can talk about that this morning because I'd be interested to hear what people think about that. Your vision about interracialism is if you think that everybody's going to heaven and we're all going to be happy and that there's no dissension, or the part of the issue is that for equality to happen, we all must come together and that whites must fight alongside people of color to help them get that, to get forward, to get that kind of equality for everybody. Let me close by saying a couple of things that I think are important. Now, this is just an introduction to these movements, but I think one of the issues and one of the problems is going back to something that Eddie Glaude said a few years ago that got everybody crazy, and that was, is the black church dead? Is the black church dead as a populist kind of movement that will be able to do the kinds of things that it needs to do within the community? Both of these organizations are not out of the traditional black church, where we think we see lots of different kinds of populism happening. And I think that's a signal, and I think the signal is two things. One is the signal is that these churches, much like mainline Protestant churches, are having their own issues with membership. They are unable or unwilling to be involved in populist movements, and that they are used to a different kind of structural way in which to go after what they want to do. In other words, they want to go through either political action, they want to go through a political candidate, they want to put themselves in a different kind of position relative to populism. And this is very different than what you might see from white evangelical churches who encourage their members to go out and be parts of these different kinds of movements, whether that's a populist movement around abortion or same-sex marriage or something else. And so I think that's a question we have to ask ourselves in the midst of looking at this. The second thing I think we need to look at is this a demographic and millennial change? And what I mean by that is Black Lives Matter is attracting people from 18 to 35. These young people are usually not involved in churches in the same way, although I haven't seen really good figures on this yet. I've seen some people who've worked with a set of 1,000 people. I want to see some more, and I know that Pew is trying to work on something in the next year that hopefully will have some better numbers. But I think what's happening is that, and what I can tell from my interaction with some of these people, is that they feel alienated against this kind of traditional organized religion. They see themselves as being spiritual but not religious, to use Bella's term, and to also think that religion is part of the issues of why the police are doing what they are doing, why people are being murdered. On Reverend Barber's side, I think what's interesting about this is that he is trying to revitalize a movement based on old norms from MLK and others. And it remains to be seen whether or not that could work. But I think for both of these populist movements, what we can say is something really definitive. There is something happening in the African American community about populism and about how it's working. And it's by looking at these movements side by side and trying to figure out what has happened and how they're shifting, that is going to give us a clue to where populism might go in the future for African Americans who have faith and for those who have no faith. Thank you.
Exemplary in terms of time. So, sorry, so now we'll have Vanessa Williams and her talk, Williamson. Her talk is Saving America Once Again, comparing the resistance to the Tea Party.
Thank you so much for having me. So today I think I want to talk primarily about the Tea Party, but I'll also sketch the beginning of a comparison to some of the left activism that we've seen arise both before and during the Trump administration. And I'm going to use this comparison to draw out an idea that I'd love to expand further in the discussion about how we think about how populism interacts with political institutions and with political opportunities. So a lot of the discussion yesterday, I think, raised the vitally important point that right populism sort of relies very heavily on a long tradition in American politics of nativism, of racism, and sort of a dividing line of sort of the citizenry versus the other. And that's, I think, undeniably the case, but it's also, the point was sort of made that it's something of a constant in American politics, or at least a recurring feature of American politics. So when we think about when populist movements become sort of nationally recognized or nationally powerful, we need to think about what changed, right? And so I think in terms of the Tea Party, the thing that most obviously changed was the election of Barack Obama, which served very much as a catalyzing moment for conservatives in the country. But I think we also need to look more broadly at the ways in which the sort of undercurrent of populism that always exists in our politics sort of finds outlets at certain times. So as a reminder, I realized in sitting up there that the Tea Party was almost 10 years ago now, which to me is crazy. Having worked on it, it feels much more recent. But I want to remind folks who maybe don't remember it. So clearly in 2009 to 2011, I'm talking about the early age of the Tea Party, you've got to remember that when Barack Obama is elected, the Republican Party was really in a crisis, right? George Bush had left office with exceptionally low approval ratings. The McCain campaign had sort of collapsed with no real structure left over from it. And the RNC itself was deeply in debt, led by Michael Steele, and just not able to sort of form a cohesive center for conservatives. And of course, Democrats had won decisive victories two elections in a row in 2006 and 2008. And of course, then we have the election of Barack Obama, a black man, a son of an immigrant, who was elected with strong support, especially from younger America, which is more diverse America. And so the Tea Party became a banner for conservatives to rally behind in a time that was demoralizing for conservatives. And it was a banner that helped rally against both the policies of the new president, but also sort of the person of the president. So the way that we've talked about the Tea Party is sort of a structure is to divide it into three parts, right? First of all, there's the part that's maybe the easiest to remember, which is the sort of grassroots older white conservatives who, for a period of time, wore funny hats and protested in the streets, and sort of had the very Americana-themed outfits, dressed like Minutemen and things like this. So these are older, middle-class white conservatives who were deeply afraid of the demographic changes that were in some ways demonstrated, I think, to the country by the election of Barack Obama. But so that, I think, was a very primary instinct. But there was also a sense, and this, I think, fits with a lot of what we discussed yesterday, that that Barack Obama encapsulated not just this young, diverse America, this nation of immigrants. It was also an America that combined the power of ethnic minorities and young people with coastal elites who looked down on us, right? And this is Sarah Palin's famous line about real America versus the rest of America. And so this was a very potent moment, I think, for older white conservatives, in that it was a moment of recognition that they had become a minority, right? At least enough to lose a national election. And I think that it was galvanizing in that way, but it was galvanizing in a frustrating way, right? Because it was not obvious that the institutions of the Republican Party were ready to respond. But there are two other parts to the Tea Party, at least as we discuss it. First of all, the conservative media. And I think that you have to sort of recognize that conservative media doesn't play the same role as liberal media for liberals, because it has very much a mobilizing role. It serves as a sort of social movement organization. And this happens in a number of different ways. First of all, the sort of role of Fox News in spreading information and creating sort of a shared identity around the Tea Party is very clear if you go back and look at the transcripts. But the sort of larger conservative media infrastructure combines sort of the Fox News' most visible element, also conservative radio, and increasingly sort of an online component that helps ideas percolate online get sort of tested in conservative radio, and then eventually arrive at sort of mainstream television. And there's excellent work by a number of other scholars demonstrating how that shapes the kind of news that mainstream media cover as well. So it's an ecosystem that had for a long time served sort of a party-building role, and is served an increasingly party-building role. But I think by the time of Barack Obama's presidency, with sort of the expansion of the internet, you start to see that conservative media plays a leading role in defining the conservative ideology, right? It's not merely a mobilizing structure, sort of a place where conservatives get together and hear the news, but it's also a place that defines what the issues are that conservatives really care about. And it's sort of a funnel for more extreme ideas to enter the mainstream. So the final component of the Tea Party, as we saw it, was sort of elite actors. And a lot of elite actors tried to jump on the Tea Party bandwagon. Who wouldn't, right? I mean, I think you see the same reaction on the left now. There's sort of a lot of anti-Trump fervor, and many, many organizations attempting to capture that fervor into their particular organizations. And of course, that was true on the right as well. Most prominently, first, I think you saw groups like Tea Party Patriots and Freedom Works. But over the long term, I think the group that really managed to capture to build its own links to the conservative base was Americans for Prosperity, which was a very DC-based organization in the early 2000s and is now a national organization that's federated, that has state-level chapters that are really quite effective at driving public policy. So when we're thinking about the role of those elite actors, right, sort of all conservatives recognize that there's this fervor that they should be able to latch onto. Some do that more effectively than others. But the groups that do it most effectively are, to some extent, a group that's primarily concerned about, in support of a very extreme free market ideology, right? And what you'll see going forward from sort of the 2009 point onward is these three forces, conservative media, grassroots conservatives, and sort of elite actors very concerned with sort of big business interests, can sometimes leverage each other effectively, and sometimes sort of struggle with real tensions between the different parts, right? And I think that this fits very much with the discussion about populism and religion, because if you look in the prior period, if you wanted to mobilize grassroots conservatives prior to about 2008, church networks and sort of the religious right movement organizations played a vital role, right? Everyone recognized all those organizations throughout the 80s and 90s as very powerful mobilizers. You see this very powerful anti-abortion mobilization. You see very powerful mobilization against gay rights. But what the Tea Party moment does is create an opportunity for other parts of the far right to build their own connections to grassroots conservatives who are mostly social conservatives. And so in this sense, and particularly, of course, to white evangelicals that make such a core part of the Republican voting base. So in a sense, the Tea Party moment, as I look back on it, is a little bit of an end run by parts of the conservative movement around the religious right as a series of organizations or a movement to reach religious right voters, right? And so conservative media already had some of these ties. There were already some efforts by sort of economic far-right organizations to build some of these ties. But the Tea Party moment is when a lot of those connections become more than just, sources of information, but actually mobilizing, organizing connections. So for free market conservatives, building national lists that were well organized at the state level was a chance to build organizations that had real activists, right, who could show up to town hall meetings, famously in that period, show up to state legislative hearings, right, show up to planning meetings for local neighborhood boards, all of these things. So conservative or extreme free market organizations built those ties and developed a kind of actual out-in-the-world base that they had really struggled to have previously. And conservative media I think, also benefited in many ways from the Tea Party moment. And actually, as an aside, I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the really striking things about watching Fox News, if this is something that you haven't had the pleasure to do. It's very much based, stylistically, it's very much based on evangelical television, right? And the minute you start thinking about that and you watch it, you'll see how very clear the ties are. There's typically the sort of strong but also very emotional male figure who on the one hand provokes fear, and then on the other hand brings inspiration, speaks directly to the audience. It's very, very common on Fox News. It's unusual for, in a sort of more news environment that it's not that common for anchors to describe their audience as you and talk about what is happening to you. But that's very common on Fox News. And I think you see with characters, characters, I say like Glenn Beck, not the real person of Glenn Beck, but the character of Glenn Beck on television, very much adopted a lot of the white evangelical manner of sort of television presentation, right? So you see this sort of stylistic connection to a very common sort of media experience for white evangelicals, but the substance is different, right? Because Fox News does not, in fact, focus very much on religious issues at all, though its guests sort of regularly assert their own religious faith. What they do instead is a much more time-tested ratings technique, right, of focusing on highly racialized issues like crime and immigration. So you're having that same experience of what feels like a very personal interaction between preacher and congregation, that the substance has changed from a sort of religious substance or a spiritual substance to and sort of a fear of, let's say, hell or the hope of salvation. And that has instead been replaced with a fear of others in the United States and what was in many ways a struggle for a long time to find a character who would serve as that salvation. Right? So I think that it's a remarkable stylistic connection, even as the substance differed. Right? So. So this is, I think, what the moment of the Tea Party is, sort of a focus on the sort of religious aspects of it, right? But there's a tension, right? First of all, there's a tension between what grassroots conservatives want and what elite conservatives provide, right? This has been true for a long time. And sort of a few obvious examples in terms of the safety net. The leaders of Americans for Prosperity very much want to cut basic entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare. Tea Party activists, rank-and-file activists, are users of Social Security and Medicare, and are not, in fact, opposed to those programs when they see them as going to quote-unquote deserving people with all the racialized implications that implies. On the other hand, Tea Party activists were very motivated around the issue of immigration, right? Immigration was a sort of symbolism. In addition to actual fear of actual immigrants, immigration served as kind of a symbolism for how the country was changing in the way that would allow it to elect someone like Barack Obama. And, of course, cultural issues like abortion. And these are not the primary concerns of major business interests in America. So, especially in the issue of immigration, works out quite well for major business interests in America. It provides cheap labor. So there's this tension there. And then, of course, finally, the sort of primary interest of conservative business interests is about unfettered consolidation of corporate power, lower taxes for the very wealthy and for corporations, and reduced regulation of other things. And these are not the primary motivators of rank-and-file conservatives. In fact, even this year when the tax bill was passing, you would see that the Republicans never achieved a majority of their base actually thinking that taxes should go down for the wealthy. That's pretty remarkable considering how long it has been the sort of primary policy goal of the party. So there's this tension, right? And that tension is something that's relatively easy to manage in opposition, right? During the Obama administration, for instance, if you take the Affordable Care Act as an example, the desire to first prevent and then repeal the Affordable Care Act was never a very serious piece of policymaking, right, as we learned later when the opportunity was available to actually change policies. But it was a very convenient kind of symbolism to assert an absolute objection to the Obama administration and its policies, and also to sort of assert that the beneficiaries of this policy were those undeserving people, right? So in opposition, and I think you see the same thing with, for instance, the fights over whether to defund Planned Parenthood, right? This was another place where opposition brought the various components of the Tea Party and the Republican Party more broadly together, because on the one hand, opposing Planned Parenthood is something that appeals to social conservatives for obvious reasons. It is also, for fiscal conservatives, it is at least some amount of money that the government is not spending, so that can be an appeal. And then, of course, I think most importantly, it's a strategically wise choice because you're disabling an important organizing force on the left, right? So for all of these reasons, it was easy for conservatives to rally around these ideas that are mostly about opposition. But, as the example I think of the ACA suggests quite clearly, the tensions between elite and base that sort of come out of the Tea Party movement are not as easy to avoid when you have to create a governing agenda. And I think we've seen that very much this year, that there's a real challenge in terms of creating policy that mobilizes Republicans. And I think it also, that tension and the tension of having some sort of positive agenda explains in a meaningful way what we see with the rise of Donald Trump, right? So looking at like the panoply of candidates that were put forward in 2012 and then again in 2016, no candidate prior to Donald Trump had sort of achieved a sort of a large, fervent, and obvious leader position in the sort of Republican nomination process. And then came Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, I think, managed to capture the I had understood the Tea Party moment clearly, and managed to capture and benefit from that tension that I talked about between what grassroots conservatives want and what elite conservatives are ready to provide. Right. First of all, of course, Donald Trump most obviously was much more open about sort of xenophobia and racism as driving forces in his campaign. He was willing to speak about those issues in a way that other candidates simply were not in the Republican Party, and thanks, I think, in important part to his experience in social conservative media, understood very much that the base was ready for a kind of language that had become basically unacceptable among elite conservatives. It's worth remembering Donald Trump, of course, was sort of his first political foray was attacking the Central Park Five. And his second political foray was claiming that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. Right? So he was very experienced in that particular kind of racialized motivation of the conservative base. And then, so he combines that sort of racism and xenophobia that a fair amount of the Republican base was not getting validated enough by conservative elites with a set of economic policies that were sort of vague enough that if you were, I always struggle with how to say this, but I think it would be correct to say that a set of economic policies that were vague enough that if you were really motivated and you squinted very hard, you could describe them as populist. Now, any closer examination that would not hold up, but there was more room, I think, to perceive that from various of his statements, which were, in fact, of course, in conflict with one another. And then, also vitally important was a demeanor that offended coastal elites. Right? That bad manners we discussed yesterday. I thought that was very relevant to the moment. So those sort of populist bad manners provided sort of a third leg to support the Trump campaign, and we can see that what Trump did was find a way to benefit from that tension that existed throughout the Obama administration on the conservative side, throughout the Tea Party era. Of course, what Trump does not have beyond, as we were discussing just last night, a powerful link to the prosperity doctrine, which I think is a brilliant point we should discuss more, does not have any plausible commitment to the norms of evangelical Christianity. So I think that there's sort of a couple ways to look at this. One is this prosperity doctrine thing that Anthea raised with me at dinner last night, which I thought was very, very smart. We should talk more about. Secondly, of course, I think it demonstrates the extent to which white evangelicals look like other older white conservatives and are motivated in important ways by kind of an ethno-nationalism rather than a religiosity. And then finally, I think the rise of Trump and his appeal to evangelical whites is evidence of the extent to which, this point I was making at the beginning, that the Tea Party moment gave conservative media and certain kinds of Republican elites an end run around the institutions that the religious right institutions that kept the Republican Party focused on things like abortion and gay marriage. So I think that the extent to which conservative media now plays an organizing role, which has been developing for a long time, but I think has really reached new levels, is a really critical part of that transition. So I want to end, and I'm going to be good and stay on time. I'm going to end by talking just a little bit about sort of left populism and how that might relate to what my sort of the longer period of time I've been thinking about the Tea Party, and sort of I've been trying to attach to sort of build a comparison in my own mind of how that relates to sort of the left populism we've seen. I think first of all, so one point of comparison that you see from time to time is the Tea Party and Occupy, or the Tea Party and Black Lives Matter, and I think that this comparison is really good for in that it can highlight for us the ways in which institutions and structures that are much broader than these populist elements have a vital role in determining their success, right? So first of all, and I think most obviously, the Tea Party was primarily a movement of opposition, right? It was a movement of opposition because Republicans were out of power. It was a movement of opposition because they were, it was a fundamentally conservative and reactionary movement to the election of Barack Obama. And in every context, of course, it's easier to prevent change than make change. And that is, of course, especially true in the American context with our very inertial governing structures. So first, that I think is one of the most critical things to remember if we're going to talk about the left and right populism of the recent era in comparison. Second, of course, and so very obviously, but I every now and again it doesn't get mentioned, so I will bring it up. Occupy and Black Lives Matter are both movements that attempted to represent traditionally disenfranchised and marginalized people, rather than economically relatively comfortable and overrepresented groups, as the Tea Party did. Finally, I would say that both Occupy and Black Lives Matter arise when Democrats are in power, right? And arise during a time when the Democratic Party has a very clear leader, a very popular leader in Barack Obama. And so there is not the kind of political opportunity, I think, that was available on the right. The Republican Party was very much struggling to find leadership in the Obama era. And so I think that the willingness, for instance, of candidates to describe themselves as Tea Party candidates is just not at all paralleled by the willingness of candidates on the left to describe themselves as a Black Lives Matter candidate or an Occupy candidate. Right? That said, so I think that there are very fundamentally different structures that govern the opportunities available to these different populist groups of the left and right. That said, I think it's worth pointing out that both Occupy and Black Lives Matter did have profound effects on the Democratic Party. Occupy, of course, is the reason why the 1% is a phrase that everyone knows outside of economics departments. And I think even more significantly, the role that Black Lives Matter played in pushing the Democratic candidates in the 2016 primary was critically important. And again, I think this speaks to the fact that there were two candidates in the primary is why there was opportunity, right, to push both sides, right? So both Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton were famously, quite impressively, frankly, I thought, challenged in the course of their primaries about their commitment to the issues at the heart of Black Lives Matter movement, and also in, I think, Hillary Clinton's case, she was challenged to ask her to repudiate some of the things she had said in the Bill Clinton era about, particularly about incarceration. So, what you see coming out of those challenges, which were extremely populist challenges to these leading figures, is a really meaningful, noticeable shift in the Democratic Party platform, which we already discussed a little bit. I mean, if you look at what either Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton were saying about race and justice in America before and after the confrontations that they experienced, it is really remarkably different, and that transition was codified into the actual Democratic Party platform. So I don't mean to, so while the Tea Party had kind of an extraordinary opportunity at a moment, I think, of real crisis for the Republican Party, then there were fewer opportunities on the left during the Obama administration. That's not to say that there were no sort of substantive political gains. Now, of course, we are now in a moment where the Democrats are all out of power, and the leadership over there seems at least somewhat less clear. And so when we're looking at the sort of indivisible type groups that have arisen very recently, and I'll speak about this just very briefly, I think one thing that's worth noting is that the demographics of the groups that are, of the people who are prominent in the local indivisible groups, as well as who are prominent in the women's marches, are primarily middle-class white women, which means that they are people who have access to resources that are not unlike were available to grassroots Tea Partiers in terms of time, in terms of political resources. And so I think that that's meaningful when we think about what, and in terms of ties to liberal infrastructure. So I think that's meaningful when we think about what might happen with the indivisible groups versus the Tea Party groups. But what's, I think, the most salient difference is that it is not clear to me that the sort of indivisible groups are on the leftern edge of the Democratic Party in the way that the Tea Party groups were on the rightward edge, at least on sort of social and immigration issues of the Republican Party. So in that sense, where the Tea Party moment very clearly accelerated a long process of the Republican Party moving rightward, it's not at all clear to me that the indivisible movement will have a similar leftward trajectory for the Democratic Party. So I just want to conclude with one last point. So if we think about populism as having a lot to do with the structures and opportunities available to the populists, then the most important issues in the immediate future to me are the rules that define who gets to participate, right? So I think that when we're thinking about populism, I think we need to think about and we think about populism as sort of a people versus an elite, a corrupt elite that are not responsive to the people. We need to look at the ways in which laws are making the elite less accountable to people. And so one example clearly is voter suppression. Another example, I think, is the rise of right-to-work laws that cripple, right-to-work laws that cripple unions. And then finally, and I think this gets a little bit less attention in terms of its political implications, but the lack of a pathway to citizenship for a large undocumented population is in fact a form of political suppression of a very meaningful section of the American public writ large. So when we're thinking about why populism rises at certain times, I think we need to think about, in my head, what there is, populism is not like an upspring that shows up occasionally. It is a river that sometimes has an outlet or sometimes needs one. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So our last speaker on the panel is Todd Gitlin. And his talk is Movements and Parties, Matches and Mismatches.
So because I resolved to be brief, I'm not going to repeat what's written, a few sentences of which I was asked to supply for the brochure. I'm going to speak very briefly and schematically. That is to say, I invite disputes about the particulars of the propositions I'm going to offer, but I want to paint with a broad brush. So let's start with what movements are. Movements are founded, and by the way, I'm not going to use the word populist except now to explain why I'm not going to use it, because I think all movements aspire to be popular and name some body of people whom they propose are the authentic people. So I'm going to talk about movements, not populist movements in particular. To me, it's a distinction without a difference. Moving on. Movements are founded not on programs or policies, but on values, on emotions, and on the music which embodies them. E.J. Dionne mentioned Michael Walzer last night, or yesterday afternoon. I am also going to quote from our common one-time teacher. When, as an undergraduate, I had the privilege of sitting in a section of a social science course that Michael Walzer taught. And I remember, I'm not sure in what connection, we were probably talking about the run-up to Nazi Germany and the prefigurations of it. And he said that the German Revolution of 1918-19 was stillborn. It failed because it didn't have a song. Now, it took me a long time to discover what he meant. It didn't mean that it didn't have an anthem. It didn't sing. It didn't have a music. It did not have a largeness. That's what he meant. The right has a song. It's a marching song. It's an angry song. It's a hostile song. It's a song with an enemies list. At one edge, it sounds like "You will not replace us," as we heard in Charlottesville last year. You, in that case, meant Jews, but more generally speaking, the song of the right is a song that evinces hatred of cosmopolitans, hatred of professionals, and hatred in general of the knowledge class, including, not least, those who are seen as protected under the wings of knowledge, the knowledge class, namely dark-skinned people. Its songs are, if you'll forgive a relatively early morning pun, folk songs spelled in the German fashion, V-O-L-K songs. They're anger songs. They're sometimes disguised as love songs, that is, love of the folk. But what's driving them, the leitmotif, the underchord, is hate songs. And the odd and interesting thing, a perversely interesting thing about our current situation, is that these folk songs, although they're particularistic, also somehow harmonize, so that the folk song of Vladimir Putin is harmonious with the folk song of Benjamin Netanyahu, is aligned with, harmonious with the folk song of Viktor Orban and of Donald Trump, as well as others. So they can be sung in harmony. Now, let me go back a century and a half. In the 19th century, social democracy did have a song. It actually was not set to music quite, but it was set to rhetoric in the Communist Manifesto of 1848, which was, in a way, for all its analytical claims and aspirations, was actually a sort of chorus of angels in a rhapsody to what Marx and Engels saw as the great unification to come. There was a chorus of angels that had worked out a fascinating, intricate intellectual system based on Hegel's choral aspirations, in which what seemed to be most dangerous and despicable about the current order was actually only the founding moment of the great supersession, the great end of classes in the triumphant revolution, to which all the exploitations of capitalism were unwittingly contributing. Now, in truth, that was a song a lot of people were willing to sing for half a century, especially, but not only in Europe. I think, in fact, that if we examine the period between 1848 and 1914, it's probably true, although I'm not a scholar of that period, so I'm taking a bit of a chance here, but so be it. I think it's probably true that between 1848 and 1914, more people actually fought and died for nationalism than for socialism. And I think it was in some recognition of that the Communist Manifesto says what a communist is somebody who goes into these national, that is to say, limited parochial struggles, and teaches people that what's really at work against them is global capitalism. Socialism persisted. Socialism, in particular in the social democratic form, was lagging along through that second half of that century as a sort of muted hymn. The death blow came in 1914, when the workers of the world, or at least the workers of Europe, refused to unite and went into the trenches to destroy each other. As students of this period well remember, or have read about, the German Social Democratic Party voted war credits to the Kaiser, which enabled Germany to go to war with France, and Russia and the rest. And one result of this fatal error of social democracy was the rise of Leninism as an alternative, which could proclaim a version of internationalism, sort of a song, until it ran afoul of reality and morally crumbled into the nonsensical idea of socialism in one country, that is Stalinism. Social democracy does not have a song. You can't replace a song with a list. Tom Edsel is right about many things. One of them is that the enemy has to be named. Who or what is the enemy? If there's an opportunity now, it's that there can be no doubt as to who or what is the enemy. Donald Trump, welcome to every enemy list. Trump is an incarnation of all the American depravities, and that affords an opportunity. I won't say much about liberalism, just to say that I think liberalism sanctifies the citizen, the actively engaged person in the actual innards of the republic. Citizenship, I fear, is on a global scale now a weak reed. It doesn't have a song either. I would say that there were times, even in the 20th century, when liberalism, some sort of hybrid of liberalism and social democracy, did have a song. And some of these songs you know because they stay with us. One of them is "This Land Is Your Land." And another one was a extremely popular song, high on the charts in the mid-1940s. I think it was 1945. Sung by a left liberal singer whom everybody had heard of. And it was called "The House I Live In." And the singer was Frank Sinatra in an earlier incarnation. Now, jumping forward several decades, I think there have been in the last 20 years 2 attempts to find the song that the whole of the majority of the populace could sing in unison. One was Mario Cuomo's speech to the Democratic Convention, in which he spoke of the American family. He tried to enlarge the family into a collectivity that would stand as the container, the vehicle, the caravan to hold the popular will. And the second was Barack Obama's "We are not blue states, we are not red states, we're all America." Those were 2 attempts at least to recognize the rhetorical problem, which is also an emotional problem. That is to say, the important thing in movement politics is not to have a program, and it's not even to have a rhetoric, but it's to strike an emotional chord in which, or through which, people recognize themselves. The we, as in we the people, that EJ referred to yesterday. So, can social democracy sing? Well, we'll find out. I want to, and I don't have a musical offering, but I do have some considerations about our current and short-run situation that may be helpful. It's important not just to have a song, it's important to have a choir. And it has to be placed, that choir. It has to be placed offline. It has to be a place where faces encounter each other. My view is that, concretely, political power, in the conventional sense, is a precondition for the much deeper and more extensive necessity of finding the common song. Vanessa and I met first at the very beginning of the Occupy movement in Cambridge. I was invited to speak with her at the Kennedy School about what this odd thing was that had just begun. And Marshall Gans, who was involved also in the organizing, has said something then. To my knowledge, he actually devised this phrase, which has become deservedly useful. Marshall Gans, long-term organizer, civil rights in the South, the Farm Workers Union, now teaches organizing at the Kennedy School. He said, is this a movement or a moment? That's a very important distinction. There's a great deal of evidence now, and it is best visited in a book by Zeynep Tufekci called Twitter and Tear Gas. It was published last year by Yale, which makes a very careful argument to the following effect. Precisely what makes social media valuable as a mobilizing tool also ends up thwarting some of the underpinnings of a movement. If a movement is understood as an enduring network of relationships which develops social trust on the basis of which people act. So the definitive, one striking example of the failure to convert a moment to a movement is the Arab Spring. In 2011, we saw what happened. Millions of people came to the square, and as now everybody knows, the initial call came from a Facebook page. Wael Ghonim, who is an executive of Google, had gotten hold of a photo snapped by the brother of a murdered and battered young Egyptian businessman, a picture that was taken with a cell phone in the morgue, and put it up on a page and called it "We Are All," forgotten his name now, something Khaled. Yeah. And we all know what happened. It went around. I was briefly in Cairo at the end of February of that year, and I learned something that I found kind of striking. This was not the first time that images of torture victims had appeared online. And in fact, I was told, I have no ability to confirm this, that the police were in the habit of putting them up in order to terrify people. This is what we can do to you. In any case, the We Are All Khaled worked. It galvanized. People came to the square. And then what happened? They succeeded brilliantly in driving Mubarak out of power. They did not succeed in creating a vehicle which was capable of governing. Now, I don't want to suggest that that was an easy matter. But there was, waiting in the wings, an entity that was prepared to govern. Well, there were two. One was the military, and the other was the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was an organization, and they had participated in the Tahrir Square uprising. They had bided their time. They came to power, and in the end, they could not, the constituency that they represented was not capable of warding off the military. And so here we are with General Sisi. The institutions, but one other point that Zeynep Tufekci makes, which I think is of great moment in this discussion. Let's imagine we're in 1955, 56, we're in Montgomery, Alabama, and the idea of a bus boycott has been proposed and embraced by the black population. And one of the prerequisites for making the bus boycott work is you have to have a carpooling system because people have to get to work. and they were heavily dependent on the bus system. So what happened? A group of women who were members of the church would gather every night, and they would make up, today we'd call it a spreadsheet. I don't know what they called it then. But I mean, they made up a chart. They diagrammed who has to be where, when, in order to take people to work and home and help them with kids and groceries and so on. And they did it. I mean, that was what made it technically possible for the bus boycott to work for a year and win. Today, it could be all done on a Google Doc. The fact that these women had to get together every day to do this work created the core, the heart of this movement. I don't mean to say that the role of Martin Luther King was insignificant or Rosa Parks. That's not my point. I'm talking about the integument, the innards of this movement ran on face-to-face activity. This could not be done as a Google Doc. And the attempt to make it work as a Google Doc, as we've seen over and over again, with Occupy, with Gezi Park in Turkey, with the Indignados, somewhat of a different story, but leave that aside for the moment. The alacrity with which people can be gathered to come together for a mobilization also deludes would-be organizers into thinking that they have created a movement. They haven't. So Vanessa talked about Indivisible, which I think is a very important effort. And one thing that's important about it is that it very quickly was converted into face-to-face organizations. It's hard to inventory, but I know I have good information about some of them. There is, for example, New York, despite our New York illusion that we don't really need to lift our fingers in the midterm elections, there are within a couple of hours driving of where we sit at the moment, at least 4 swing districts. 3 of them in New York, 1 in New Jersey. I'm sure there are others. And there's some others where people have mobilized, led, as Vanessa said, in general by women and by middle-class women. So there is, for example, a group in the southern tier, just north of the Pennsylvania border, a group called something like the Committee for a Better Southern Tier. And they meet regularly. They have been organizing demonstrations at the office of their very right-wing Republican Congressman Tom Reed. They have had 50 demonstrations. They have 50 to 100 people at their meetings regularly. They're ready to go. I mean, they have a very long shot race because it's an extremely rural district, and although it includes Ithaca, it is not Ithaca. But the Indivisible movement consists of groups like this. I could give you other examples if you're interested. I know of examples in California. I know of examples in Illinois. I know of examples in Pennsylvania, and so on. So, where are we? So, while our institutions are striving, the institutions of liberal democracy are being dismantled. I mean, you know this, but let's just pause for a moment to look at what Trump and his party have accomplished. Deregulation to beat the band. Most recently, it was announced that a sector of the EPA, whose job was to do research on the toxicity of chemicals that are added to children's clothing, has been disbanded. That's known as the deconstruction of the administrative state. And speaking of the deconstruction of the administrative state, it's also reported today in the Times that the ambassador to Mexico has resigned. Ambassadors and foreign service officers are flocking out of Washington. They, and of course, out of other institutions where they hope to do, let's say, civil rights work in the Justice Department and so on. On the left, it has long been assumed that the state was a sort of faceless thing that did the bidding of the ruling class. I'm being crude, but a great deal of this has been crude. One left-wing thinker who did not make the mistake was the former professor of sociology on this campus, C. Wright Mills, who in his canonical book, The Power Elite, wrote that it was necessary for a democratic society that there be a professional civil service. Now, a professional civil service is a political expression of the knowledge class. What it proposes and acts on is the premise that in order to make policy that's attuned to values, you have to know what you're doing. And Trump has obviously, with his contempt for science, his contempt for any kind of order or decorum, his rejection of reason, has successfely driven many of the knowledge class out of government. God knows what prices there are to be paid for that down the line. And this is not just Trump's doing. I think it's perfectly evident that the Republican Party has for a long time been hungering for Trump. When Mitch McConnell interfered with the confirmation of Merrick Garland, this was an anticipation of the practice of exercising brute power without scruple and getting away with it. So, but I'm not going to close on that note. Well, actually, one more note about the setting we're in. This is a big one. 2 out of the last 3 presidents were elected without a majority of the popular vote. Let me say it again. 2 out of the last 3 presidents, they both happen to be Republicans, and they both have been extremely and devastatingly consequential, were elected without a majority of the popular vote. That's something, because it's locked into the Constitution, it's hard to imagine overturning it, but it actually defines the bedrock. It defines the burden we carry even as we try to do the doable, to be, as Michael Harrington used to say, the left wing of the possible. So I want to end by saying something very practical. The midterm elections are 8 months away. I have been trying to inventory groups who are doing voter registration work. It's very hard to find out what's actually going on the ground. There are groups who say they're doing it, and there are some efforts that I think are notable. In Los Angeles, for example, there's a congresswoman named Karen Bass on the coastal in West LA. And she's been organizing bus trips out of a sure Democratic district to nearby districts that are swing districts. There are actually 3 of them in Southern California. There are 9 of them that are in some degree of doubt in the state of California. 9 of the 24 that have to be turned. So there are people who I think are not just talking the talk, actually walking. Here comes my peroration and lamentation. When I walk onto this campus, I have yet to see a poster that says, "People, we need to register voters in New York's 1st Congressional District, Long Island, 2nd Congressional District, Long Island, New York 19, Hudson Valley, right up the road, New Jersey, I forget the number, and so on. Come to this meeting, we're going to be doing this." Where is the so-called campus left? Yelling at Milo, whatever his name, Yiannopoulos? thinking it struck a great blow against racism by shaking its fist at Mike Chernovich? That's not serious. I find this deplorable. And it, by the way, it's not just this campus that is in default. I have found campuses where efforts are made to get students to register, and that's very good. It's important. But students have energy, and to be confined to the playpen and working nonstop to rectify the way we speak to each other in the playpen, that's not politics. And finally, it is one of the hopeful signs of this dreadful period that now we see high school kids. I don't longer expect very much from college students, but now when high school kids can simultaneously be members of a victim class and articulate leaders of a movement, that's really something. That never happened before, to my knowledge. The high school students organizing projects of the 60s, both in the civil rights movement, as in Birmingham, Alabama, and in late SDS and anti-war activity, both followed the mobilization of college students. In this case, these kids are leading. And it's not only that they are magnificently eloquent and presentable. 5 days after this massacre, somehow they had succeeded in organizing bus trips to Tallahassee. I have no information about how they did that, but that's organizing, okay? If you can do that, you can do a lot. So I'm ending on this note. I have a great deal of pessimism of the intellect and guarded optimism of the will. Thank you.
Okay, so let me open this to questions. I'll have questions, but I'll wait for others first. Yes?
Thank you. I have several questions. First of all, the issue of militarism.
Could you use
It's not commonly known.
Excuse me, but these have to be questions, not speeches, please.
We're talking about very important stuff. And I listened to people comment all last night. The militarism issue is the sacral religion of Trump. It's not commonly known that in '82, he gave $1 million to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial downtown. Wayne Barrett, the late Wayne Barrett, who wrote the first really substantive biography of Trump, signals that as his entry into national politics when he did that. And I'm wondering how one deals with that, because that is a quasi-religious issue, political religious issue. Secondly, the issue of ideology. You know, Todd, I saw you down at Occupy. They were subsumed with anarchism, all sorts of types of anarchism. And we're dealing now, if you have to deal with songs, we're dealing with a doo-wop a cappella, a sort of neo-fascist and neo-Nazis of the world unite kind of thing going on in the backdrop to all this around the world, taking solace from Trump. Trump actually speaking favorably about Marine Le Pen. So I'm wondering how we look at that. When do we start seeing seriously, does populism as a social science explanation really work? And when do we start actually thinking about, are we really dealing with a different form of neo-fascism and neo-Nazism emerging around the world here?
Thank you. Anybody who wants to answer?
Well, I mean, is this work? Yeah. Let me just say that I think I don't have any doubt that Trump has done these heinous things, and I have no doubt that there is a malignancy abroad in the world, and that Trump is an important he's an important commander in this legion. But that said, you don't fight. I'm going to quote Rumsfeld, I think. Sorry about this in advance. You go to war not with the army you wish you had, but with the army you have, or words to that effect. We have resources. We have strengths. There it is. These people are doing damage in every conceivable fashion, and all you can do is win against them. That's all I'm interested in doing, winning.
Thank you.
Jose? Oh, sorry.
No,
Did
it's
you want
okay.
to say-
It's okay. I can pass.
Okay.
Go ahead. Now, I just want to comment about the religion piece you brought up about these people kind of coalescing around the world. One of the things I think is really interesting, if you go back, I think it was 2013, when Anders Breivik killed everybody in Norway, okay? We did a little experiment on Twitter. We were kind of cross-hatching everything in his manifesto. And most of what was in that manifesto were things that came out of the United States, okay? And religious things that came out of the United States. They were nationalistic things. It was Jeff Charlotte and I and a bunch of other people. And I think this is one of the biggest things that's being ignored right now, at least in my field in religious studies. I want to shake everybody because it's like, this is the Crusades, folks, okay? This is the Crusades all over again, but it's panning out a different way. But there are these Christian nationalist nodes to this that bring all the rest of it together. And until we start to realize that, how this is going around the world, whether that's Germany or, Brexit in England a certain kind of way, or Norway, or all this other stuff, we've missed the boat. Because Trump just locked himself into that. I mean, if you think about it, I remember the morning that Brexit happened, I was in Spain, I was thinking, this is bad, because this just means that the dominoes are going to start to fall. And we fell next. And so I wonder if we can start to try to think about this in a bigger way, that's a populist movement that's got a, as you say, Todd, a song. And it's a pretty heavy song with some pretty heavy drums right now. And I think that it's going to take a lot to make that song silent.
Jose?
I like very much Todd's narrative song, but I could not stop thinking that we are doing to global reality what Vanessa said the white conservatives are doing to the reality in the United States. They shall not replace us. I mean, your narrative song was only about the West. The Communist Manifesto has the greatest resonance in Russia, in China, in Vietnam, in Korea. Once upon a time, the largest communist party in the world was in Indonesia. And today, basically, we cannot understand the crisis of liberal democracy everywhere without the crisis of Western hegemony. Liberal democracy rose with Western hegemony, and whether it can survive the fall of Western hegemony, we don't know, but very clearly Western hegemony is gone or is falling. And so unless we take seriously the global reality and how we can reconstruct the song we are going to do in terms of this new global reality, I don't think that we are going to inherit the future. And so this is I know it's a very negative, but it's a call to basically open up our perspective beyond what is basically the West. We cannot understand this global crisis of liberal democracy without this global transformation. Actually, Obama was good enough to recognize that the United States cannot anymore be the global hegemon, and obviously a lot of people didn't like it when they heard it. He was honest. I mean, for a president of the United States to recognize it is a grade of honesty, and obviously he paid for it. But I think that we, at least as scholars, that looking at the world, we should at least recognize this transformation and what it means for our political projects.
Michael? I'm just accepting that as a comment. I'm not repressing responses to you. Right, okay.
I have a question, which is also a comment. Yes. In my understanding of populist movements in the U.S., especially white-dominated ones, but also the at least king part of the Black freedom movement as well, nationalism, Americanism, patriotism, which are not the same thing, kind of civil religion were always really crucial to what they were articulating. And House I Live In is a good example of that, written by communists, but nevertheless seen as this great liberal anthem of patriotism. And I wonder if it's possible for there to be a left populism today without some version of that. I don't think, in many ways the left is today internationalist without having a real international to be part of. But there's good reasons why the right has sort of appropriated nationalism and Americanism for itself. And I wonder whether this is a problem for left populists going forward. I think it is, but obviously we see this in Europe too. One of the reasons why social democrats have been declining so much is a lot of people in those countries who used to vote for social democratic parties now think they care more about the immigrants than they care about us. That's a question.
Okay.
Anybody want to start?
Well,
I'll
somebody,
start.
whoever wants to.
I'll start. If I think about this in terms of Black Lives Matter, yeah, because I think part of the question is that these definitions about what Americanism is or nationalism have to change. That's part of the issue. Because you can't, I'm thinking about, King and Malcolm X would always have these things about, they would appeal to the founders and the framers in certain kinds of ways, right? Whether to critique them or to ask the question. And I think now people are like, we're not invested in that project anymore. We want something else. And I think that that's where the beginning of the change has to happen, because it's back to your thing, Juan, about thinking about how we have to do this in a more global way and not just be about the West. America has to be redefined. And it needs to be redefined in what it already is, which is an amalgamation of people who were immigrants and all this other stuff, right? But we've never thought about us as a global entity. We've only thought about us as a global entity in terms of militarism and power and might. And so now that is being reconfigured. Whether we like it or not, Trump is a horrible agent. I like what you said about him. But Trump is an agent of destruction because he has shown where all the fissures are in this country. And this is a big fissure about what America is and where we're going to go. So my issue about this is kind of different. I would say that the civic engagement project has fallen apart. And so that project of civic engagement that taught you how to be a civil servant and do all of that stuff has failed. And if we have people who are also tearing that structure apart, then how do you put it together again to narrate what this country is supposed to be? And so I don't think, I hate to be a fatalist, but I kind of am. I don't know that this is, that the left is going to make it, because the left doesn't even know how to define this, let alone, because they want to define it in the old terms that don't exist anymore. And if you can't do a project of redefining and all this stuff, we're going to lose, and I'll put myself on the left, we will lose 2018 because we can't even get people to go do what you just said, which is register people to vote. Very simple. Is this part of your civic duty or not? Do you not care that they might have stolen an election because they made stupid bots and messed around with electoral machines and all of this other stuff? So until we could talk about these big, giant issues about what America is and all of that stuff, but if we just start to come to the realization that America might be a failed state right now,
Oh, might be.
it is. I'm being nice. I'm being charitable. I'm not being my normal self and just say it's all messed up, folks, and it's over. If you think this thing is not over, it's over. It's time to think about what we need to make it instead of what it was, because the was is gone. The moment that this guy got elected is gone.
I'd like to ask a question. Oh, do you want to say
No,
something?
I'd like to,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Then I'll ask the question.
In the spirit, I want to respond to both in a way. I said I don't have the song, and I don't mean to say I don't have the actual lyrics and the music. I have both a set of specifications and a yearning. Mm-hmm. But I want to, on this question of, who is it to be an American? So I want to recall two moments from the civil rights movement. I don't think it's generally well understood why Martin Luther King was in Memphis on April 4th, 1968. Two garbage workers had been crushed to death in a truck. The garbage workers, who were largely, if not exclusively, black, had been trying to organize a union, and the city had been futzing around. They organized the strike, and Martin Luther King went there to help the strike. If you go to Google Images and type in Memphis, March, April, May, March, April 1968, I'm sure you'll see an image of people holding a particular sign. The sign read, "I am a man." Now, the rhetoric was different in that time. They did not mean "I am a male." "I am a man" is the international music, right? That is to say, I deserve these rights. I deserve the right not to be brutalized by virtue of the fact that I'm a human being. So that has to be in the song. Sometimes that's the dominant song. Sometimes the other song is a national song, but it's, we are the America of Frederick Douglass. Douglass gave this great speech, which is usually published under the title, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" We read it in our great books course. His argument is that the Constitution is a great freedom document. Yes, there are all these slavery-imposed strictures in it, the Three-Fifths Rule and so on and so on. But he is thinking aspirationally. And he's urging abolitionists, most of whom were probably African American, to take over the American story. And that is also a crucial component. I think there are times when "I am a man" is the outstanding theme, or is the first in the program, the musical program. And there are times when, something else is. And, the art of politics is an art, and the art of politics is in knowing when to deploy which, for which purposes. I mean, we need smart generals. We don't need just troops, and certainly we don't need just ideologues. So I think we need to be able to muster more than one key. And one final thing about universalism, there are two phenomena that actually bind. Well, there are three phenomena that bind the world now. Okay, in unity. Number one is nuclear weapons, which are still the greatest threat to the persistence of humanity there is. Second is climate change, which is already afoot, as you know. It obviously plays out differently if you're, on the one hand, a resident of Mornings Heights, or on the other hand, a farmer in Bangladesh. But it is at least, there is a common enemy, and it's carbon in the atmosphere and those who put it there. If there's a third common element, it's what we call global capitalism, which obviously plays out differently if you're here rather than there, but at the very least, it's sort of a framework that people can understand as that which we want to transcend. That's not enough.
So if I can jump in
Yes.
quickly on that. I was thinking to myself about this, and I was thinking precisely about this point of the need for a common enemy in forming a single people. And it was something we were actually talking about earlier. So, it's a worrying concept that you have to have an enemy to form a single people. But I think these are some examples of enemies that might not be so worrying to confront more directly. I think it is a real challenge on the left right now that those enemies are not very often discussed, and they're not very often personified, which I think is a really key portion of defining an enemy. But the other thing I'd say is there's that, and then there's the other way to create a people is to make a space where they have to work together. And I think that we are short, particularly on the international level, on spaces in which we are obliged to work together. I can care about what's happening outside of the United States, but only within the United States to some extent, as you well pointed out, and perhaps even more locally than that. Are there spaces in which I can join with my people to make decisions and take an action about those things?
What would they look like?
I don't know.
The person who has spoken most eloquently against these three enemies, against precisely nuclear war, any kind of war, against global capitalism, against
Francis.
Yeah.
That's what exactly I was saying. I'm sitting here thinking it's the Pope. He's the only one. Yeah, he's it.
Okay, I'm going to ask my questions. For Todd, well, okay, I'll just say that I don't believe we need an enemy, and I don't believe we need to construct, I mean, just within the United States, or anywhere, to construct us as a single people. I'm adamantly opposed to that. I think that actually the three things Todd mentions in terms of but that's global, the nukes, the capitalism, and the ecology. But there's local things too. I mean, domestic things that what we need to do is construct ourselves in terms of who we want to be aspirationally, meaning in terms of a set of values, not a substantive identity. I don't believe we need to understand ourselves in terms of a single people. That's one thing. The second is that, or at least as a conglomerate, there are other names for this. I'm still with the populism thing here, authoritarian populism. Now this brings me back to, so as far as the question for Todd, you know, you said that you talk about Tahrir Square, you know, these instant mobilizations through Twitter, big bang movements, okay. And you said, well, the problem is that, I mean, you're criticizing this kind of mobilization as not really being a movement and because they're not capable of governing. I would say that's not really a distinction between older and new social movements, because no social movement, quasi-social movement, aims to govern. It aims to influence those who will be in power. Now, there have been party movements and elements in movements that are interested in becoming part of political society and ultimately governing. They form parties and get elected. But so I don't think that's the distinction. I do think what we have to see, and it's an old problem, that is that unless on the latent level, i.e. not visible, not the big bang mobilizations, unless on latent level you do have grassroots organizing, then these things will be shots in the pan. So it's just a theoretical distinction, and I'm into that. So that's just one point. I do think we need a song. I'm not quite sure what song we're going to need. For Anthea, I think this is relevant to you. I thought it fascinating, because I don't know it. I mean, anything I learn is, by definition, fascinating for me, that some of the movements, like Black Lives Matter, are in a sense bypassing the organizational structures of the church, and they have a critique of the hierarchical dimensions of it. Finally, at last, I mean, you know. So, but what that means to me in a way is that, and also what you said about Christian nationalism, is that when you say spiritual, not religious, in effect, there's a critique of religious identity politics that are actually authoritarian and not particularly religious in a way, and I should have given this as a paper, but in an article I wrote on civil society, populism, and religion, I took over a distinction between religion between identity politics and religion and religious concerns. These are not the same. Christian nationalism is not particularly Christian, I have to tell you. Neither is, by the way, there's no monopoly on this. Let's talk about Jewish nationalism, let's talk about Muslim nationalism or internationalism, which has very alarming forms as well. So no political religious entrepreneur has a monopoly on this. They're equal opportunity employers of any religious rhetoric they can take up. But of course, the religious entrepreneurs also use it. This is a two-sided thing. But what's interesting, so we have to think of the distinction between religious identity politics and issues of religious faith, et cetera. So that's the other thing. I guess I had a third one, but I can't remember what the third one was. Okay, it'll come to me. I do think that the distinction between popular and populist, a distinction which was elided in Anthea's talk, I think that distinction matters. I'm willing to say, we've been fighting this out for 2 days already. I'm willing to say Roger Smith came up with a good idea that I'll use just to clarify things. So I don't like the left-right populism because I think populism blurs those distinctions, but we could say authoritarian populism and then leave other things open. I don't think all social movements are populist. The women's movements never claim to be the part that stands for the whole. No one ever said we're... The civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter never said we are the only true people. That's just false. Or that we are the whole. It didn't happen. How could it happen on one level? And it shouldn't happen. So I don't think, certainly the new social movements that I studied and we were both part of, didn't do that. So I think there really is a difference between a part that that defines itself substantively, white, Christian, nationalist, sub rosa, male, although the girls can help us out, that this is the part that is the true whole. substantively. That's very different than saying, even than saying we are the 99%. That's not a substantive claim about an ethno-national, racial, religious identity. It's something else. It's saying, inequality is so extreme that the gap is so wide that we have to deal with this kind of exploitation. So I'll stop there. Anybody want to respond?
Just
Yeah.
a quick, just to take on the question of who are the people. I have a vivid memory of a riot in Berkeley in May or June 1968. It began as a rally called to express solidarity with the French uprising. And so there were a lot of people milling around in the middle of Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley. And various law enforcement organizations showed up. And one of them read the Riot Act, I guess, which in California begins, "In the name of the people of the state of California, I tell you, you better leave," etc. And there came from a segment of the crowd this resounding roar, "We are the people." And I thought, this is trouble. If you think you are the people, then how does it happen that Ronald Reagan is the governor of California? Who are those other people? No, but I'm talking about the dangers of delusion.
Right.
That's
Well, that makes my point, precisely. But you also understand what it meant. They didn't say the people in the streets, the groups in the streets in Berkeley and everywhere else. This wasn't, you couldn't define them ethnically or, okay, so that's there's a question. Oh, wait. Wait, I'm sorry, Sandra, I didn't see it. Or
she's
you
had her
first.
hand up.
She had her hand up at
Yeah,
that.
I can't, there's something about these lights that are killing me. I can't really, I can't see that side of the room.
Thanks. This is such an important conversation. So I want to, play in the playpen for just a second, right? So, one of the things that, the social theorists of sorts have been caught up on since, a couple decades, let's say at least, is the constitution of the social, right? And the sense of we sort of talked about it a little with maybe the Anthropocene or what religion has to offer. But if there's a need for a telos, there's simultaneously not an ability to do that in a secular world, right? The notion of grand narratives or progressions seems off the table, and simultaneously, suddenly there's an invitation to include all sorts of other beings and entities, right? Like lichen or, rhizomatic constructions, right? So it seems like there is a need to step back for a second and think about what the politics are of new forms of kinship or old forms or not or whatever, but to think about what that social means in a world that's so lodged for most of the folks growing up in talking about mediated relationships and different kinds of technologies, et cetera. And maybe we think that's all false consciousness and we want to kind of re-articulate a sociality that's really human and local, et cetera. But I feel like one of the things that makes it hard to decide who a we is that question, right, that troubles all the theorists in the playpen really is part of daily life and everybody's experience and does need a narrative. So what do we do with the resources at hand in order to serve that question so that maybe we can get a little traction on a new way of talking on the left?
So I can.
Person for that.
No, I'm going to reveal here my failure to continue to be a young person. No, so I think that there's this interesting question, and I'm gonna fit it together with what you guys were just talking about, actually. So in some of my recent work, I've been looking at how Americans talk about being a taxpayer. This is a thing that Americans say a lot. I pay my taxes and the end of that sentence is never about taxes, ever.
Right.
It's always about their right to be heard, right? And I think this gets a little bit to what you were saying. And there are kind of two ways, in some of my new work I look at, there are two ways in which people define themselves as taxpayers, right? And this is a very long history in the United States. There's the exclusive way, where you're like, I'm a taxpayer, and someone out there is not, right? And in the sort of modern context, that's immigrants or it's welfare recipients or something. I'm a taxpayer, I'm the other group, right? But then there's this very long tradition of people defining themselves as taxpayers when they were not allowed to define themselves as
They were not
citizens.
allowed to
define themselves as citizens, right? So you see this, to some extent, the civil rights movement very strongly in the women's movement for suffrage, and in fact, some of the so there's this, and of course, originally, of course, taxation and representation being part of our sort of formative language, right? And so I think maybe that example fits a little bit with what you're talking about, right? That there are two ways of talking about being a people. One is to say, we are the people and someone is not. And the other way is to say, we are the people too. You know,
Right.
I am a man, right? And so I think that we shouldn't blur that line, right? That there are these two different rhetorics, but that doesn't mean that there's no value in that assertion of peoplehood.
I need to respond to that. I think that actually really hits on a point I've been trying to make, and I'll call it authoritarian populism so individuals don't freak out. But the logic of what I would call authoritarian populists, whether it's now lots of movements, everybody uses the people, and that's irrelevant. But the logic of the claim that we are the people, and for example, the voters for Ronald Reagan aren't, that's really dangerous stuff. And it happens all the time in what I would call, let's call them authoritarian populist movements of the right and of the left, by the way. The left, not the kind of left or liberal left, whatever. The authoritarian left, which was never into democracy or civil rights, et cetera. Okay. The other version is a project of inclusion.
Yeah.
What do you mean? I'm also a citizen. I also have the same rights. I should have the same rights as you, et cetera, et cetera. And you can escalate that. You know, you can expand that group, and that's been we need. I agree with Rogers. We have to talk more about the achievements, and not just this fatalism and negativism that right-wing populism feeds on. Well, there have been some achievements. You have to fight for them. One step forward, two steps backwards, especially in terms of race in this country. 10 steps backwards, but still. Martin Luther King talked about the arc, and so the projects for inclusion. Of course, you can use the name, the people, the citizenship, et cetera, but precisely because you claim inclusion, you're not talking about a substantive concept of the people. You're talking about a narrative about how the right values that we should understand ourselves are, i.e. egalitarian, inclusive, democratic, et cetera. That's what you're talking about. And you can call us, that's what we Americans stand for. I'm fine with that. I don't care if you call that nationalism. That's what everybody should stand for. That's fine. But the substantive stuff, which is what I think the authoritarian populists really play on, in every form, that's the stuff we have to fight. Yeah.
So
Oh, I'm sorry. He was next. Sandra was next, then you.
I was going to just say, I like very much, Todd, what you said about the song, because I think that is important. And but at the same time, it's worth mentioning that, Occupy Wall Street was a moment and not necessarily a movement, but it did articulate an issue, we are the 1%, which actually did filter into the broader discourse and in a way surfaced as Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders had a song. He might not have been the right singer, but he had a song.
What was the song, Sandra?
His song was "You're Getting Screwed."
That's not a song. That's a lamentation.
His song
Well,
was
but
his song was
The fact is that
his song was democratic socialism or social democracy in a
The
new
fact
way.
is, as many people showed up to his rallies as showed up to Trump's, and so he hit a note
He
that
did.
people heard.
Absolutely.
I wasn't a supporter of his and so on, but I have to recognize objectively,
Yes.
he hit a note that people resonated to.
Feel the burn.
And so one has to figure out, as you look forward, is there somebody, maybe somebody who can articulate that? A song that's been going through my head in the last year is the Who song, "We Won't Get Fooled Again," which is something one could sing to white working class Trump voters who are going to get screwed, as we all know. And so that we are the 1% or we are the 99% is actually a pretty valid unifying thing. We don't like the idea of having enemies, but as Tom Edsel pointed out in his most recent column, having something to push against is
Yes.
fundamental. It's not hard to push against Trump. It doesn't mean that you're demonizing or villainizing all the people who voted for him, but he objectively is an objectionable person and stands for objectionable things. You can push against that without then creating a huge us and them sort of narrative. 99% isn't bad.
When I said a moment is not a movement, it doesn't mean I'm against moments. And moments have value. But Bernie Sanders. So to me, there was a negative epiphany. I voted for him in the primary. But I had a negative epiphany along the way. It was one of the early Democratic debates. I think it was when O'Malley was still running. But it came a moment when the moderator asked Bernie, so you say you're a socialist. What does that mean? Maybe he was democratic socialist, whatever. You say you're some kind of socialist. What does that mean? So what did he say? He gave his boilerplate speech about capitalist, rich people's billionaire domination. That was it. Then he put the question to Hillary, not Bernie did, the moderator. Said, well, so then she gave a list, what she did. But one item on her list was tax credits for corporations that create profit-sharing systems. And I thought, what she said is actually more socialist than anything he said. He had nothing to offer except the denunciation. And that part of, I think, both his achievement was in saying there's a, if you will, left-wing way to be angry that actually is called for. But he never actually offered, I'm not talking about a list, he never offered a principle. Like, let work belong to, let the work belong to the people who do it, or let the proceeds, whatever, many such possibilities. So that's a real shortfall.
Well, there was one question, that's the last one, we don't have time, so very quick, okay?
So even though it's quick, it's going to be a two-parter. So that's, yep. So I was at an event recently with Naomi Klein and Michelle Alexander here on Riverside Church, and one of the things that's really stuck with me from that conversation was a comment that Naomi Klein made about how one of the true greatest victims of global neoliberal capitalism has been the death of the collective imagination, to think of something what could come beyond, and that we're sort of stuck in this moment. And that combined with the recent reporting, which I think has been wonderful, from Ezra Klein, thinking about what impeachment might look like. And even though he mentions in numerous places that he doesn't believe impeachment is even possible, but I've been stuck on thinking about the mechanisms with which we have access to as a democratic population within the system as it currently stands, right? So I think we're talking a lot about a populist movement that aims to potentially influence government or get into government and then change things. But, we mentioned ecology, which, as Naomi Klein says, puts us on a universal deadline to get these things figured out. We think about gerrymandering, and I want to push back against some of this idea of, even though we're saying we're against this talk of we the people, there's also quite an understanding of, well, we can push back against Trump and understand that we're not talking about all the people that voted for him. And I think that in red states in certain places around the country, I don't think that is entirely true. I think that even the way, well, as someone who comes from these places, and as someone who interacts with these folks on a daily basis, more or less, there is a revisionist way of understanding and looking at history, that even when you talk about someone like Martin Luther King, they're not talking about King in the same way that we are talking about him in this space. And I think it's important to understand the way in which so many elements of our society had led us to a point where we are having separate conversations, whether we like that or not. So my question is truly, to what extent do you think that the democratic mechanisms with which we have in our current traditional understanding of government are feasible, and to what extent do you think we need to think beyond democratic institutions and structures in more of a revolutionary moment?
Well, we have 1 minute to go.
If you don't have the people who can organize to win power through legitimate means, where are the people to come from who are the revolution? Come on, man, get real.
Yeah. All right, we're done. Until the next session. I have a concept for a song, but I'll tell you on my session. I have a concept for it. A song and a list. I mean, a concept and a list. Okay, see you the next panel.